Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Great to have you here. This is the opening of TEFAF Coffee Talks and TEFAF Afternoons. So delighted that you were able to make it in spite of the weather. But as I said, New Yorkers are hearty people, and the weather doesn't stop us. I want to put a plug in for all the coffee talks and TEFAF afternoon conversations that are going on this week. They're all listed in the brochure that was on your seat, so please have a look. It is, as the New York Times said, an all-star lineup of talent for these programs. So I'm very pleased that you could be here to start us off this morning on our birthday celebration of Tintoretto. I'm going to introduce the moderator, and then he will take it from there. And that is John Marchiari, who we're delighted to have, I believe, for the first time. Everybody else on the panel is a repeat offender with Coffee Talks. He's the Charles W. Engelhard Curator and Deputy Head of Drawings and Prints at Morgan Library and Museum. We're delighted to have them. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. I'll get a bit into the idea of what's going on and why Tintoretto this year and all of the shows. But first, to introduce the other panelists, what we thought we would try to do is give a variety of different perspectives on Tintoretto. So I'm a curator, and next to me is Andrea Baer, who is the newly appointed Deputy Director for Collections and Administration at the Met, and also the Jane Reitzman Curator in the Department of European Painting. So we have a kind of scholars or curatorial perspective, but branching out from that, next, John Landau, who is a collector of Italian Renaissance paintings and sculpture and of French 19th century paintings, who is maybe the most enthusiastic visitor to my show at the Morgan so far. And then at the far left is Christopher Apostle, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of Old Master Paintings at Sotheby's, but also wearing a second hat today as a board member and head of projects for Save Venice, which is very much involved in all of the shows and all of the restorations that have happened this year. So why Tintoretto 500? What's this about? We know that Tintoretto was 75 years old when he died, and so subtracting from that, we know that he was born either in late 1518 or early 1519, so it's the 500th birthday celebration. Now, lots of artists have birthdays, nice round ones, come and go with one show or no show, but in contrast to that, this year there are 5 or 6 shows. It began with a show that started in Cologne and went to Paris earlier this year. At the moment here in New York, we have Drawing in Tintoretto's Venice at the Morgan. We have, what is the title of your show? Sorry.
Celebrating Tintoretto, Portrait Studies and Studio Drawings.
At the Metropolitan. There are 3 shows on in Venice right now, one at the Accademia on Young Tintoretto, the major retrospective at the Palazzo Ducale, and then an interesting show at the Scuola di San Marco as well. And then in the spring, the Morgan's drawing show and the show, a version of the show from Palazzo Ducale, both go to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So 5 or 6 shows in the end, as the curator of one of the curators of the Venice and Washington show said, 10 different sites, 10 different venues with Tintoretto in this year. And I can't recall any other artist being celebrated with quite this intensity. So the idea for our panel today is really to try to dig into the why. You know, why is Tintoretto so engaging to audiences 500 years later? So having said that John was maybe my most enthusiastic visitor to the show, somewhere as we went through, he blurted out, well, you know, Tintoretto really is maybe my favorite artist. So I'll begin with the question, why?
Well, when my wife Barbara and I started collecting in the late 70s, our first area of interest was modernist American painting. And I became my favorite artist at that time from years of collecting that material was Marsden Hartley, who we wound up with collectors sometimes count these things, 18 paintings. And as my taste sort of went backwards into the 19th century, and I started to collect French painting before Impressionism, my favorite artist was Courbet. And then when I took the big step going farther back 20 years ago into old master painting, Tintoretto became my favorite artist from this period. So my answer to the question is from a collecting point of view, which is a subjective point of view, what do these three favorite artists have in common? And what they have in common is tremendous intensity that they are able to put on the canvas, the incredible attention and ability to find the significant detail and leave the rest out. And in each case, I experience a very clear spiritual dimension in the work of these artists who remain, along with Tintoretto, who I think is the greatest of those three, but not by, well, Courbet is pretty, that's a closer call. But anyway, so, and this is, and I'd even go a step further, and because it's subjective, and say that for me, despite my love of all Venetian painting, whether it's Bellini or Bassano or Lotto or people considered to be Venetian or Veneto, painters of the Veneto, he remains the strongest and the one I'm most interested in adding to the 5 Tintorettos that we currently have, one of which is at your show and 2 of which are at the Palazzo Ducale right now, which I take great pride in.
So I mean, it is a subjective choice, but I mean, in other ways, you could look objectively to something like the restorations done by, say, Venice. I think you've restored twice as many Tintorettos as anything else. Now, is that driven by the enthusiasm of Frederick, or is it driven by the enthusiasm of, well, perfectly on cue? Frederick Ilchman, who is one of Tintoretto's great defenders and promoters, or is that the people who support, say, Venice? I mean, why the enthusiasm, do you think?
Well, we've done projects for, say, Venice from before I was even on the board for many, many years. We tackled in the early 80s the Paradiso in the Palazzo Ducale, the world's largest canvas picture, took 3 years. So it's something we've always looked at and someone we've always looked at. But certainly I think being very aware of the upcoming anniversary birthday, we did sort of look at opportunities to make a difference. And when you go around the Palazzo Ducale, say Venice restorations almost bookend. They're scattered throughout. I think there are 9 things that we've restored, 8 or 9 things that we've restored in that show. I think we were able to make a difference. In the sort of the first or second room, I guess it's the second room, there's a canvas from the Church of San Marziale, and it's Saint Martial, who's a pretty rare saint, ascending sort of into heaven or in glory between St. Peter's and St. Paul's, and it's from a church that San Marziale, near the Madonna dell'Orto, which is the great, temple with San Rocco in Venice of Tintoretto, and it's never open. And by sort of going in there, and the Boston chapter underwrote this restoration, and we were able to put a very clean, beautiful picture that people rarely see back in front of them. Similarly, at the very end of the show, there's a late work about 1582, 85. It depends on, I don't know how you date it, early 80s anyway, of San Jerome with the Virgin appearing to him. And that's from the Ateneo Veneto, again, a place where nobody really goes. And I would venture to say probably you guys who are passionate, maybe you've seen that before, but I'm not sure. So that's sort of one thing that really informed our decisions. You know, it was a big opportunity to make a big difference.
And so maybe the question now for you, Andrew, is why decide to take on an exhibition project?
So we knew we couldn't and didn't want to compete with these major exhibitions that were going to go on. But at the Met, I did want to do something to bring attention to Tintoretto, because our own collections are so rich in works by Tintoretto. And in fact, interestingly for me, when I look back over the last years of work on our collections, we had spent a lot of time studying our works by Titian, by Veronese, by Lotto, and it was time to really dig into the Tintorettos in the collection. And that's how I started. We have 4 very important pictures. We have a whole group of drawings. I wanted to install them in some complementary way so that people could look at both the drawings, and that I did with the collaboration of my colleague Alison Noguera in the Lehman Wing, and to look at the paintings. And soon into that project, I got very intently, some people would say even almost unhealthily, drawn to our portrait. We have a fantastic portrait of an unknown man that was completely obscured by a varnish, a mid-century varnish that had gone absolutely gray, and the painting looked completely flat. So I insisted and insisted. We finally got it up to conservation, where they were a little nervous, and that's why they had held off for some time. But in fact, we found that although somewhat abraded, the transformation of the painting under the conservator's hand was remarkable, and I do think that it has emerged as one of the great masterpieces in portraiture by Tintoretto. And it was that which set me on a road to think about the portraits further. And the second step to that was looking more closely at a painting that my professor at Princeton, John Sherman, had cataloged in the Royal Collection catalog as being a preparatory study for our painting, which I then went to England to see and to study. And that picture, if you go to our small exhibition, which is a focus show of one big gallery in the Lehman Wing, you'll see that it is the comparison of our portrait with this one from the Royal Collection that gets the exhibition started, because that is a small, intently observed, unbelievably present picture of a man, which to me almost leapt out of its time in its sense of intensity and vivid quality. And that's what then set me off looking for other pictures of that type.
So you're all talking about qualities in the art, things that engage you in the pictures by Tintoretto. But he's also one of these romantic artists. He's an outsider. He's the anti-Titian. He's not pretty, clean Veronese. He's this rough painter whom the early biographers portray as this kind of mad genius, the impetuous genius, the terrible mind. How much do you think? I mean, all of you deeply invested in the art, have talked about the art, but how much do you think the biography, the idea of this romantic artist, this rebellious artist, plays into the popularity?
Well, in my case, it's close to zero, because I've developed this great love of art, visual art, over all this time, and I find that I'm not that interested in biography. I'm interested in the paintings. The paintings are the biography, and it's sort of somebody else's job to chronicle all of the historical legends and sort them all out, but what I'm interested in, like in this discussion we were just having, is that I like many other people, had developed an impression about Tintoretto that his portraits, while they could occasionally be great, too many of them were somewhat perfunctory or done too quickly, and and were more commercial products than more personal expressions of his vision. And the great thing that's happened, one of the great things that's happened with these multiple exhibitions is that between Andrea's exhibition and the major exhibition at the Palazzo Ducali, which Frederick and Robert Eccles, in curating it, took a very strong position about the portraits. And there is a hallway with 10 or 12 of just incredibly great Tintoretto portraits that make an absolutely, combined with your show, a definitive statement about his greatness as a portrait artist, which I was found very inspiring and enlightening.
So if
Sure.
I could pick up on the original thing about the biographies and the mythologies and so on, I'm going to say a few words, but then we really need to hear John on this same issue. I of course find them very interesting and provocative and want to get to the bottom of them. So that's a different approach.
Well, John said it was the scholar's job to deal with that.
That's the different approach to it. And the history of the polemics around Tintoretto as an artist of prestezza, of speed, which had both very positive and very negative connotations at the same time, and sometimes with the same author, is very, very interesting to follow. But in my little tranche that I was looking at, the stories about his portraiture were extremely interesting to follow, and there's not enough evidence to say how much is true and how much is not true, but they do lay out a biography in which portraiture was very, very important. His first pictures that were shown on public view are said to have been unusual nocturnal portraits of himself, a self-portrait and a portrait of his brother. And so I tried to follow those stories as well. And I'll just tell one very short one and then turn it over to John, because there is a story about how Tintoretto tried to paint Henry III, the French king, who was visiting Venice, and he snuck on to the Bucentoro while there was some kind of state visit, and he made a quick sketch. So you can see I was interested in the sketch part in colored chalks, which we know were being developed at that time in Venice. Bassano was making colored chalk drawings. None of the Tintoretto ones have come down to us, if they ever existed. And then he went off and built up his portrait in different ways. So that's a 17th century story about this unbelievably intrepid artist who, sneaks onto the Dogel ship and so on. Is that true? I don't know, but it's a fantastic way to get into the story of how a portraiture was made.
But it also leads us to interpret all of the portraits in a certain light as well. And so one of the things that my show wanted to get into is how much you can rely on these 17th century accounts of Tintoretto or even 16th century Vasari during Tintoretto's lifetime, writing, he just worked at random, without design, without planning, without thought. And at a certain extent, my show is an extended argument with Vasari about how Venetians in general draw and how Tintoretto made careful preparation, which is not to deny that he put himself forward as the artist of great prestezza, of great ability to knock something out in 15 minutes, and how he is a kind of anti-Titian in leaving things rougher than Titian might have done. So on the one hand, yes, there's a kernel of truth in every one of these stories of the biographer, and then there's all this evidence that's visual, that survives, that tells a very different story.
I'd jump in as well and just say, from my perspective, a lot of the rule breaking that you see with Tintoretto, and obviously, as you say, who knows what's true? Rodolphi could be just following these same tropes that Parmigianino did the same thing, doing sketches of visiting the emperor when he was there. But I would say from the restorations that we've done recently, you do notice that he's quite thoughtful, but also kind of transgressive, or trying new things. At the Salute, where the Marriage at Cana is 1561. It was for a refectory, so traditionally it would have been done in fresco, but he does it obviously on canvas, and we've discovered he does it with sort of an unusual medium, with an unprepared canvas and with tempera and maybe a little oil mixed in, so he's trying to emulate that sort of same fresco look. So you see it, different paintings painted different ways, and he's just sort of, I think he's probably thinking about how he's breaking rules, and I think that probably is true of him.
Yeah.
That he really, he was thoughtful in his recklessness.
Or at the very least, one image that I think has come out in lots of the shows over the past year is this idea of constant experimentation. I mean, you see him trying new media and new approaches to drawing throughout the show. You see him working up pictures in different ways, sometimes working basically alla prima in the portraits, and then other times layer upon layer of essentially a painted drawing and building a picture up that way. But that fits too into a bigger idea of 16th century Venetian artists experimenting more generally.
Well, from the so-called collector's point of view, the problem with this in collecting old master painting is that more than in any other area of Western art, the ongoing brilliant research being done provides us with new information and occasionally results in reattributions, which is a very bad thing for the collector.
Depends on which way it
So,
goes.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's the
most
greatest
part,
blessing.
You don't want to be sitting there with what was 20 years ago regarded as a Tintoretto masterpiece that is now attributed to his son Domenico. You know, that's the.
But
that's
what if
the,
it becomes a Titian?
Well, you know, that's well, it's not as good as a Tintoretto, but it's acceptable.
Some of us might regard it a lateral move.
Anyway, just the practical role of scholarship. I mean, it is a field, collecting old masters, where between you have to have a certain amount of courage, because between the condition aspects of 500-year-old objects, the fact that we know more today about, and are learning more today about most of the artists and the milieu than we've ever known before, and that from a scholarly point of view, these are all fluid matters. But from Christopher's point of view, and also from the point of view of the collector, you want things to stabilize at least enough so that you can make, you can have confidence in your decisions. You know, that's a nice thing to aim for.
Well, actually, I could jump in there too, because our exhibition, there's a wall of drawings, and then it ends with what I consider the puzzle painting in the Metropolitan Museum, which is a very beautiful lyrical finding of Moses, we think. We're not even 100% sure about the subject, but it goes back exactly to what John is talking about. And when I opened up and said that of our Venetian pictures, the ones we had studied, to my mind, least, were the Tintorettos, part of it had to do with the fact that they were so fluid that it was hard to get your hands around them. So this is a picture that is attributed by some of the great scholars who have worked on Tintoretto to Jacopo, and by some to Domenico. Some people said it's done in 1550. Some people have said it's done in 1580. Some people have said that it is unfinished. Some people have said it's finished and looks the way it does because that's the aesthetic. Some people have said there's a second hand in the picture, painting the landscape in the background. So trying to get your hands around all of these variables and say anything definitive about it is a tremendous challenge to us. I can only imagine what it would be like to someone who sees such a painting on the market and is trying to say, am I going to put my money behind this?
Well, what I would say to you in that particular case is that's a big help.
We made suggestions.
Carry on.
But it is inherent to this particular discussion with Tintoretto, who did train his son, whose son was very talented in certain areas, and in the workshop practice of drawing, which John's show demonstrates so brilliantly, of how Jacopo shows
Taught
other people how
how
to draw in his own style, right? So,
And I think
Yeah.
he's also an elusive artist, Tintoretto himself, because he's perfectly capable of painting different ways and different
Right.
manners. He's happy being like Veronese or Titian and bouncing back and forth. And when I started looking, doing the show, I mean, dating I find still elusive to me.
Unbelievably hard.
So the little portrait that you put from the Uffizi, which is, you date to 2 years or 1 year before the Miracle of the Slave, 46, 47, I think I don't see why that couldn't be later. It's almost so
because
sophisticated.
it is dated.
There you go. But I would have visually, with that little bit of information, I might have said it was
Exactly.
5 or 10 years
Exactly.
later. So, and they're
Yeah.
all by Tintoretto, and that's
Yeah.
peeling away things that could be by Marietta, who we don't know anything about,
Right.
or Domenico, or all the
Or
Northerners.
any of the other 25 people who
yeah, but
who
then the
can't
other
even
thing
fix
is-
a name.
The other thing is when you look at the date and you say, oh, this is correct. He dated this picture, and then someone says, well, let's see if that's his date, or when was it added, and is it on top of the varnish or underneath the varnish, and even something as simple as that turns into a mystery.
Although that goes both ways too, because every now and then someone cleans a picture and finds a
Absolutely,
signature
absolutely.
hidden underneath, which is a nice confirmation.
Well, I'm sticking to it because the Uffizi tells me it's so, and I've seen it with my eyes, and
So
I
we should
believe it.
just- Okay.
No, but he is maddening as an artist because there's no one progression from beginning to end. I mean, he paints the Miracle of the Slave, and then the next year paints some pictures that you would think were done a decade earlier. They seem to go backwards stylistically, and yet there's all the evidence you need to confirm that they come after the Miracle of the Slave. And he paints in different modes. He leaves ceiling paintings sketchier because no one's ever going to see them, or now we do, but he never imagined anyone would. Exactly, a ladder with modern lights, but otherwise, a picture up there in the Sala da Maggior Consiglio, no one could ever have seen what it really looks like. And that, for scholars who like things to be neat and clean, is just maddening. But I imagine too, for collectors, where is ground zero? And this was the attempt. This was the great attempt and the great sort of shift in Tintoretto studies, beginning with the Madrid show. The attempt to formulate a core group. The Madrid show in 2007. The idea of what does a bona fide 100% or 80% by Tintoretto look like, as opposed to all the workshop pictures. So that was, in a way, phase one of the current reevaluation. And then I think, some of what Andrea has done, certainly some of what I've done, is the attempt then, okay, so now what are the mechanics of the workshop? And how do you get from the core group of pictures to Domenico or one of the other assistants in the workshop? Now, going back to something we alluded to earlier, I mean, we had the collector's point of view. Does the enthusiasm for Tintoretto translate into a market for Tintoretto? I mean, do you get the sense that he's more esteemed or more highly sought than Titian or Veronese or Lotto or Bassano?
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I think I am the market. I wish I was. I think that on the rare occasion when unambiguous works of high quality appear, of course there's a demand for them, but in terms of things of a slightly lesser order, I think it's quite unpredictable. Now, Christopher, you had the lovely picture that was in the provenance of, was a part of the David Bowie estate.
Right.
That's a fascinating picture.
Documented picture, and
Right.
we know where it was painted for. And
it did pretty well, but it didn't do...
well, you didn't buy it, did you?
No, I didn't.
There you go. You're saying something.
Okay, I'll stop there then.
I mean, I would say, great picture, great picture by any of the great painters in the market. People are going to want. I mean, the portrait that we had, which is in your show, which belonged to Gustav Rau, this incredible bearded man, perfect condition, obviously the top quality picture by him. That's now the world record of just over 3 million, I think. But yeah, I think, someone that's adept like you who can see the levels of quality and understand that a picture like the one at San Damiano from San Gimignano is a very good picture. There are areas that are maybe a little wonky. It's less attractive to you. You mean, yeah. It honestly, as an auction house person with that different hat on, if I put that on for a second, we allow that in the price and, how we're estimating things and expecting things to do. But it did well. It's an impressive documented picture.
But I wonder whether Tintoretto here in the United States is a household name in the same way that some of the other great 16th century painters are. I don't think that for someone stepping into the old master world, the old master market, it's a name that's going to necessarily ring a lot of bells. For anyone, of course, who has spent a serious time in Venice and has gone to see the Scuola di San Rocco or the Madonna dell'Orto, those people it will thrill. But there are a lot of people who haven't done that, gone to the Scuola di San Rocco. And so I would say that if we, your Titian on the face of it is going to have a more immediate recognition and appeal. And even last night, we had a very interesting lecture at the Met about the fourth of our paintings, The Miracle of the Loaves and Fishes. And up until the very last moment, I was worried about whether our small auditorium would be filled for exactly that reason. Would somebody come out on a Friday? How many people would come out on a Friday night to hear a lecture about a single Tintoretto painting? So, but we did have a very good crowd. He's an in-between one, I would say.
We always say, if you're a Ninja Turtle, then you make top dollar. Raphael, Leonardo. But
Yeah.
Tintoretto's not a Ninja Turtle, so.
No.
Fair enough. So now you all have seen all of the 3 shows in Venice and the shows here in New York. Well, okay, you've seen at least the big shows in Venice. Do you feel like there is a consistent image of the artist who comes out across all of the shows? We talked a little bit about how he seems constantly experimental, but is it a consistent picture of Tintoretto that emerges from all of these different projects? Can all the parts be put together back to create one man, or do we have fundamental problems?
I think between Andrea's show and Frederick and Bob's show with the portraits, it's a very consistent, the A-level Tintoretto portrait. I now have a clear idea of how really good he is and how close he gets to Titian portraiture. He's not doesn't have anything to be ashamed of in that sense. For me, the early work is a little bit more complicated, so I would say that's confusing, and how he gets from in 2 years up to The Miracle of the Slave. But I think that probably confuses everyone, where how he gets from sort of a pretty okay painter to like this genius. So I don't know. That's what I would say.
I would answer in a couple of ways. I would say my impression of Tintoretto, the sensibility, is captured in the early self-portrait in Philadelphia. What I see is a person of utter determination, a person of profound seriousness, and a person with the bravado to go on and take on all kinds of challenges that people hadn't previously taken on. I think when we talk about the body of work, to me, Tintoretto was a man in motion. He was, the amount of work that he generated is one one of his primary characteristics. And he really brought movement into painting in an unprecedented way. I think of him in very broad strokes as the person who invented really a modern sense of figure movement. And there's a very interesting comparison I've sort of made over the years with Titian, because Titian did not do that. Titian did not, it wasn't on his agenda to create the incredible fluidity among characters and the complexity of compositions. Titian was more about the gravity, the weight that he could generate. That's my layperson's impression. So I combine those two ideas as my main idea about this genius.
Should I?
Yeah,
So,
sure.
I'm not an overall Tintoretto scholar, so this is also my reactions to the exhibitions were to try to understand what the scholars, Frederick, Robert Eccles, Roland Krechel, who did the exhibition that was in Cologne and Paris, what they were trying to do and to understand it better. So some of the things I came away with and I think are different than the way that before I saw those shows. One is this complexity of the early years, which we've now seen in two completely different exhibitions with different
we should
strengths.
explain. So the
Yes.
show, the Cologne Paris show, was Tintoretto, A Star Is Born, about his emergence.
Yes.
And then the Academia show that's on now is about the young
Exactly.
Tintoretto. But there aren't very many paintings that even were in both exhibitions.
Right.
I mean, they're
Very
completely
different
visions of
But
who he was. And
They
how
both sort of take him up to that great moment of the miracle of the slave, where he seems to emerge full-blown, in a sense. So it requires further thought, certainly on my part. What I did like very much about the show at the Academia was that I did come away with a very strong sense of how he was absorbing the work of the artists around him. So Titian, obviously, but also the wonderful artist Andrea Schiavone, who's more or less his contemporary, Bonifacio de Pitati, that he was part of a group of artists who were truly transforming Venetian art in around 1540, let's say. And that came across very, very strongly to me. The other thing that came across so strongly to me in the Palazzo Ducale, and especially because of the work that Frederick and Save Venice with Christopher did, is the importance of seeing the Tintorettos in these restored states, that they gave me a completely different sense of his palette in some ways, and of and of his creation of space. There were always fantastic pictures about space. We haven't talked about that, but that is, of course, one of the things that Tintoretto was doing, setting up narratives within amazing spatial constructs, sometimes based on theatrical backdrops that he knew or things that he saw in books about architecture and so on. But that sense of the space completely relies on the values and the colors being true and how things progress back into space. That was enormously eye-opening to me in the Palazzo Ducale. And the other thing was you used the word spiritual early on. I'm a great believer in late styles. I think that some great artists had moments, the last 10 years of their life or whatever, in which they're trying something completely different. I think this is true in music, and I think it's true in literature, and I think it's very true in art. And in Venice, with these long-lived artists, Titian, Bassano, Tintoretto, the end of their lives are remarkable. And when you get to something like the Baptism from San Silvestro or the late pictures, there is a spirituality to them which is just knocks your socks off.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the one, the picture that you mentioned, which Frederick first showed in his exhibition in Boston a few years ago about Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. that baptism that comes up at the end is like, with all that you know of Tintoretto and everything you've seen, is just a shock, you know,
And yet, at the same time, everyone hates the Paradiso because it just, you know, seems to be a slide off into.
It's a lot of work to study, you know, 1,000 figures one by one with the you know the glasses up there.
Exactly, you know, and there are different modes of painting. You know, just as we talked about how you have the Miracle of the Slave, and then a year later, a picture that seems to be from 10 years previous, so too in the late pictures you have these intensely spiritual works, and then you do have what are decorative paintings that were made quickly, largely by the workshop, even if under Tintoretto's own supervision, or even if by Tintoretto himself. There are constant modes that he switches through. There's the great Annibale Carracci goes to Venice and meets Tintoretto and is greatly impressed by him, but then later on says, you know, the problem with Tintoretto is sometimes greater than Titian and other times lesser than Tintoretto.
But you see, but I have a little opinion about this, as I do most things, as you can now tell. If you're making judgments, if you're trying to make calibrations as to levels of quality, right? I feel like what you're interested in is the comparisons need to be based on the greatest work that the artist did. I don't care how much secondary material or inferior material they've done. That's forgettable. That's just, you know, but when you have a Scuola San Rocco, you know, that puts you up, that puts you way up there just for openers, you know. I mean,
no, but I mean, this tradition, I think, is the Tintoretto problem. It's why the Tintoretto works at the Met were less studied. It's why he was the last of the great Venetians to get a monographic exhibition. There is so much that is secondary.
I think, you know, what you were talking about earlier about him being less familiar is also a product of the fact that so much is still sitting right where it was painted for. I never understood Tintoretto as a young person interested in Italian until I went to the Scuola di San Rocco and saw the great crucifixion there and saw the whole, you know, what you see in America with a few pockets in Washington and the Met is pretty, and in his living room, which is pretty good. You can't get him. So it's exactly part of the problem.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think at this point, you know, we have a little while left, but some of you must have questions. So we're happy to open the floor up if anyone has any questions.
So in 2011, the Venice Biennale, my friend, the curator, B.J. Kruger, she put three Tintoretto painting as a centerpiece. So she was trying to show he's still modern or contemporary. My interest, I come from more like modern contemporary art world, and I'm not expert, but I do see painting. For example, sometimes the portrait Pope reminds me of Bacon. So I wonder your view on how he influenced contemporary artists.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. Why Tintoretto does strike us as a modern painter in the way that El Greco, who comes out of Tintoretto to a certain extent, is always cited as a modern painter, someone who remains an inspiration, in a way that Veronese or Titian really doesn't. And what is it that makes that difference?
Well, there I would say it's the painterly quality, the sense that it is the way that he puts the paint on the canvas, and you follow that incredible sort of jagged white lines that are forming the highlights. He breaks apart the forms in a way that has allowed his brush to just run over them. I would think that a lot of modern painters are drawn to that and like to see works that are left in that state in which you can read the artist's signature brushwork in such a strong manner. I have to say there's a Tintoretto portrait upstairs here, which has that kind of almost electrifying brushwork. And this is probably out of line to say this, but I believe it actually has been sold to a contemporary collector. So there you have somebody who normally buys contemporary works, who is drawn to that picture, and probably before that, very strong painterly quality.
We had a panel at Sotheby's with Jeff Koons and John Curran, and they were asked each to choose their favorite painting in the world. And both of the contemporary painters, Jeff Koons and Curran, chose Venetian paintings, and Jeff Koons chose Tintoretto, the Suzanne and the Elder from Vienna. And I think it's exactly what you say. I think it's also the unorthodox narrative, the way he, his composition is kind of bizarre. And, Titian, who was terribly innovative, but because he's now orthodox, we probably don't realize it as much, but Tintoretto just,
He had a different way of breaking rules. I mean, had anyone ever put the table in a Last Supper at an angle going back into
coming
the
right
picture,
out you.
in the middle ground?
With a man, the biggest man in the picture on the left, pulling up his socks or pulling down his socks. I mean, they break rules about storytelling and decorum, too. Yeah.
I know David Bowie collected quite some of his paintings, and of course he's a musician, but he's also art critic, so I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where it's interesting to get back to that question of how much of that is intuited in the picture, from how much of the sense of Tintoretto as a rebel is apparent to a contemporary viewer who isn't a scholar, who doesn't know the life story, who doesn't compare Tintoretto to Titian or Veronese, but somehow a contemporary collector just intuits that there's something to this old 500-year-old painting that's different from the other things around it in an old master set.
When you go into Madonna dell'Orto and the huge vertical pictures that are just cascades of color and images, I felt as a just as a viewer, I said, well, geez, I just have never seen anything like this before. And I've never seen an earlier painting this free and this expressive.
Right, this forthright about the evidence of it being made, in a way. There's a transparency in the process, which I'm saying, although my show argues that it's not casual, that the end effect looks like he's just started slapping paint on the canvas, but we know that he didn't, and yet he has a self-awareness about style to finish up and still look as though he's just done it in 15 minutes. Even a vast painting like the Madonna dell'Orto choir. Other questions? Yeah, I knew there would be one back there.
Curmudgeon, here he goes.
I'll keep. Just interesting what Andrea said a little while ago about Tintoretto not being as well known to North American audiences, and that's because, indeed, we agree many of his great works are in Venice. I did about 8 years ago or so a show on 6 years ago, I guess, on Veronese in America at the Ringling Museum, and John Marchari helped with that project too. But you couldn't do a reasonable show of Tintoretto in America. There's just not enough variety. You could do good portraits, and that's about it. But Veronese, you could show really all aspects of his career. But I actually, part of, again, Tintoretto celebrations, yesterday morning I was the guest speaker at a Columbia University graduate seminar on Tintoretto. And when I'd finished, 2 hours of slides, I asked any questions, and one said, well, what's there left to do? And I think there's a lot, certainly more on Domenico Tintoretto, more on his patrons, particularly the non-major scuole patrons, but the lower level patrons, maybe collectors. Early collecting has been done by Linda Borian, but he becomes a brand name, at least in Venice. But I thought it'd be worthwhile asking the two curators here what would they think would be good avenues for exploration, and then John Landau and Christopher Apostle, what they would, just as people who love Tintoretto, what they would like to know more about.
Well, It's interesting. It's not a question I thought about. What next? I mean, I feel like I did my Tintoretto project for the moment. Exactly. Yeah. What would I nominate some other person to work on? I think there's probably a lot more to be done. Actually, I do have an answer to this. I think there's still a lot, for all of the restorations that have been done, I think there's still a lot more to be learned about his process by doing more technical study, especially of the big mural paintings. So we can do infrareds and x-rays of the little cabinet pictures, but how he would have painted those is very different from the way he paints a 14.5-meter tall canvas for the Madonna dell'Orto. Now we have drawings for them that have squaring grids, but no one's ever pointed, so far as I'm aware, a good IR camera at those paintings to find out where the grids are there underneath the final paint surface. So I think, especially for the monumental works, the Scuola di San Rocco, where there is this kind of study done only of the small panels in the ceiling of the Sala della Vergo, but not of the crucifixion. Do the drawings we have, I think we have drawings for 6 or 7 figures in the crucifixion in San Rocco. Was it because he only made 7 drawings, all of which are squared, or are we missing the rest? Would there be squaring under all the figures or only under those for which we have the drawings? So that kind of work, which would tell us more about the process and his how he worked up on this enormous scale, would be really interesting for us as scholars to find out. And I think that kind of forensic investigation would be an interesting project for the public as well.
So I'm going to punt, but it's my actual response to that question, which is that with the work that has gone on between the Prado exhibition and everything that's on today, we've created a huge amount of new information, hypotheses, suggestions, and so on, new ways of looking at the pictures. And I think actually it's a moment for reflection and to try to take all of this in, and that in a couple of years, in a few years, students reading through all of this are going to be able to synthesize and find new avenues of research. I really do think that this is the moment to look and read everything that the scholars who have been working on this now for many years have done, and that it will take some time before the major new avenues of research appear, but they will appear based on what people are learning from these moments.
I'm interested in, those turning point moments that you locate in the body of work of artists that I have come to love. And we had 2 shows, one in Germany and one at the Academia, that tries to explain St. Mark and the Slave, which seems to emerge. I mean, it's such a phenomenal painting, and the question is, how did he get from his rather more simple and unpromising, in some cases, start to such a transcendent work? And both, I didn't see the German show, but the show at the Academia, which had great things about it, had some great pictures in it, but it did not answer that question. You did not see. Jean-Luc Godard made a movie about the Rolling Stones called Sympathy for the Devil, and it showed them writing the song, and different versions of it as it's going along, and they're quite tedious, and you wouldn't think there's anything special. And then there's the next version that you see, where it becomes the song that it was, a great masterpiece of the Rolling Stones. But the guy missed that piece that belonged here to here. He missed it. And I don't think that, I feel a little lost with how great that picture was and how did he get there at that moment in time, so that's my that there's further research after 2 different exhibitions have had totally different.
So I think Andrea might be right. Forget this generation of scholars. That's not going to be solved at this time.
With my Sotheby's hat on, my obvious answer would be, where can I get a masterpiece for my January sale by Tintoretto? It's a perfectly legitimate question.
Not from me.
I'm not getting one. I want to get one maybe that you might like. But with my Save Venice hat on, building on what I think Andrea said, which is, and John has said, I'd like to get more of this information about the physicality of the pictures out there. Maybe, someday, our archives are huge with sort of really interesting bits of information. For example, the Ateneo Veneto, we found there's a binder of proteins of some kind that he mixes in, which is unusual. So what was that about? And it seems to also be painted in a different way. And putting that information out there is going to allow, I think, people to make some interesting conclusions about how he painted, why he painted, how he adapted his style for whatever the purpose is. So I find that a particularly exciting part of what we've done.
Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure we're happy to sit here and answer more questions if you want to come up after we're finished, but have a good day. Thank you for coming.
Thanks to all of you. I'm sure you'll agree with me that this was an extraordinary conversation, an opportunity for those who know little about Tintoretto or those who know a lot about Tintoretto. Either go see the exhibition or go back and see it again, now with new eyes and new information. I think that's what makes a conversation like this totally worthwhile. The other thing I want to say is that if there's some part of this that you want to hear or see again, we have live streamed this on Facebook, so it's available to you, and if you want to recommend it to somebody else, it will then be final, gorgeous version edited for the website, as will all the conversations that go on during this week and have gone on since the fall of 2016. They are all available as resources and ways to share these conversations with other people. So thanks again to this fantastic panel. I don't think you're going to get a better conversation than this. And thanks to you.